The purpose of today's video is to look at the AQA multiple choice section of the 2018 series. And the multiple choice section is in paper 3. So there are 3 papers, each marked out of 80. And paper 3 is themes in economics. So that's micro and macro combined. And the 30 question multiple choice section is quite an important aspect in this paper, as it accounts for almost 40% of the marks. Now, the purpose of today's video is to look at the hardest questions according to the examiner report. So these questions are in which the majority of candidates did not get the correct answer. And we'll have a look at why. In a lot of cases, these questions had choices that were distractors, prominent distractors, as the examiner report calls it. And it's basically that they're choices that seem to be correct when on the outset. And as a result, some candidates kind of took the bait and fell into that trap. And as a result, I'd like to use this time to clear up some of the misconceptions. So let's start off with question 2. At the start of the financial year, an economy's national debt stands at 1,000 billion. So the national debt refers to all debt still outstanding. So money that the government still owes. And that is debt that might have been issued 30 years ago or 50 years ago or 10 years ago, it doesn't matter. Any debt that you still owe and needs to be paid back, that stands at 1,000 billion. And the budget deficit is how much the national debt changes. So in other words, the budget deficit refers to the specific year. So over the course of this fiscal year, the government plans to spend an extra 100 billion pounds and borrow an extra 40. If the government achieves its spending and borrowing targets, by the end of the financial year, the national debt will have increased by how much? Now, one of the things that the candidates got incorrect was that they thought that the budget deficit was 100 billion pounds. And here's why that's not the case. The budget deficit refers to the difference in spending and tax revenue. So it's whatever government spending that could not be achieved from the taxes that the citizens paid in that particular year. So let's say the government wanted to spend, let's say, 900 billion pounds a year. If they collected 900 billion pounds of tax revenue, then that's good. There's no deficit. And as a result, we haven't added anything to the national debt. So if the government plans to spend an extra 100 billion pounds, there's nothing wrong with that. That doesn't mean that the deficit is 100 billion pounds, because if the government manages to find the extra 100 billion in the form of tax revenue, then we're safe. The question is, how much of that 100 billion has to be borrowed? Now, the best part is the question tells us this. It's borrow an extra 40 billion pounds. So that means 60 billion of the 100 billion pounds that the government is planning to spend. 60 billion comes from tax revenue and 40 billion will have to come from borrowing, and hence that's the deficit. So as a result, the national debt has increased by 40 billion pounds. Because that's what the budget deficit is. The budget deficit is simply the change in the existing national debt. So as a result, the national debt will have increased from 1,000 billion to 1,040 billion. And this represents a 4% change. And in order to do that, you simply do your new value, which is 1,040, minus your old value, which is 1,000. So the change in debt is 40, divided by the original number, which is 1,000, times by 100, and you come to an answer of 4. And hence why the answer to that is A. Now, many candidates said either B or C. Now, the reason why B seems like a reasonable answer is because the extra 100 billion pounds is what tricked them. That they thought that the extra 100 billion pounds they assume that that's going to have to be borrowed. But the reality is, if you can find tax revenue, then that's great. Then that doesn't do anything to the deficit. So let's go on to the next question. And this was considered to be quite a difficult question. It's only about 35% of candidates got this question correct. So this question refers to the market for renewable energy. So imagine that I'm, let's say, a firm that sells solar panels. So think of me as a solar panel supplier. The renewable energy market is initially in equilibrium at price OH. Now, why is that? It's because of the interaction of demand and supply. And we get to a meeting point N. Now, the reason why we're at S1, there's no reason as such, just that whatever I'm able to supply at a given time, that's where the supply curve will be. Now, what I want to know is, how do we get from S1 to S2? The shift in supply is the result of the subsidy. Because what a government subsidy in effect does is it essentially bears some of the cost of production for me. So let's say it costs me £50 to make one solar panel. Well, what a subsidy will do is the government might, let's say, might give me £15. And as a result, the cost of producing a solar panel for me, the firm, is now only £35. And if my costs have gone down, that means at any given price, I am able and willing to supply more. And hence why you see that shift from S1 to S2. So the shift is the result in the subsidy. And what happens is we have a new equilibrium at the meeting point M, culminating in the price G. So what we know is that the equilibrium price has changed from H to G. Now the question at hand is how much money, the total amount of money that I have been paid as a producer from both the consumer and the government. Now, the first thing to keep in mind is what is total amount of money? Total amount of money received is in effect just the total amount of revenue that I make from selling my products. So my advice to you, if you get a question like this and to approach this question, is just break it down in 2 steps. First, just see how much is the consumer giving me, and then also how much is the government giving me. So let's start off with the consumer. So the consumer, we pays price times quantity. That's what I want to know. So first I want to know the quantity. How much quantity will I sell? Brilliant. It's E2, because of the meeting point between D and S2, the equilibrium. So the equilibrium quantity is E2. So we know that part. So we can highlight this. Then what we have to think is at what price? What price would are the consumers paying per solar panel? And it's G, because of the interaction of supply and demand. So as a result, this area here represents the total amount of money that just the consumer has given. So not the total amount of money. And that's why A is wrong. So now that we've established what the consumer has given us, now let's have a look at what the government is going to give us. The problem at heart is that we know what the quantity is. So that's brilliant. So we can start off here saying, okay, cool. That's how, so we're selling E2, and how much subsidy am I receiving per unit? Now, in order to know that, I need to know, well, it's how much, so what is the new price? In order to do that, what you have to do is first find your new equilibrium price as a result of the subsidy. And that's great. We know what it is. It's G. So at meeting point N, that's where our new equilibrium is as a result of the subsidy. But then you have to ask yourself, at E2 quantity, which is our new equilibrium, what would the price have been if I wanted to supply E2 units at the original supply curve, right? At the supply curve before the subsidy. Well, in order for me to do that, if I wanted to supply E2 solar panels, I would have had to charge a price of J in order to get that done, as you can see here. And the reason is because you work your way up until you hit the previous supply curve. Now, as a result, we can deduce that so KLM is the size of the subsidy. Essentially, this gap between S1 and S2 represents the size of subsidy per unit. So as a result, this whole area here, GJKM, refers to the amount of money that the government specifically has given me, because they're giving me KLM per unit times by E2 quantities, and hence this area here. Remember what we said about the consumers? The consumers was represented by OGME2. So as a result, this entire area, JKE2O, that represents the amount of money that both the consumer and the government combined have given me. So as a result, if we look at our choices, OJKE2, the answer is D. Now moving on to the next question. This is question 14. This is a micro topic, and it refers to total and average product in the short run. And this is the data that you have been given, and diminishing marginal returns is what the examiner is asking for. So that's a key part of the question, diminishing marginal returns. First of all, you have to ask yourself, what is that? So diminishing marginal returns is when a firm experiences a decline in the marginal product when an additional unit of labor is added. Okay, the problem is we haven't been given marginal product. Now, before we can do that, is we need to first think, what is marginal product? Marginal product is the change in total product when you add an additional unit of labor. And what we're looking for is the marginal product to fall. So now that we know that marginal product and total product are linked, because it's the change in total product, what you can do is then draw yourself a separate column, like a new column, and call it MP. So MP is the marginal product. Now, for the fourth worker, because we haven't been given any data before the 128 units of total product, there's no way of knowing what the marginal product would be at the fourth worker. So that's fine. We just answer that with a dash. Now let's look at the fifth worker. Well, the fifth worker, when we introduce that fifth worker, we now produce 260 units. So how much more output are we producing? Well, that's 260 minus 128. So that's 132. So our marginal product is 132 for the fifth worker. Let's go on to the next part. The sixth worker, they now produce 420 units of output. So 420 to 260, that's 160. So as a result, the marginal product is 160. Now, let's look at the seventh worker. 497 is our new output. And the question is, what is the change? So the change will be from 420 to 497. That's a change of only 77 units. So our marginal product is still positive, but it's clearly declined from 160 to 77. This satisfies our condition for diminishing marginal returns, and hence why the number of workers is 7. So the answer is C. Let's moving on to the next question. Number 20. A firm benefits from significant and persistent economies of scale as it increases in output. Which one of the following is the most likely consequence as it grows in size? Now, before you approach this question, and this doesn't just apply to this question, but any other question, is first just think about the topic at hand. So the topic is to do with firm size and specifically large firms. So you could think of the theory of the monopoly as the topic at hand. So think back to your A-level microeconomics and think about some of the main features of a large firm. So what are the features of a large firm? So they have price making power. And if you remember that, and if you remember from your monopoly diagrams, the AR curve is not horizontal like it is in perfect competition due to that price making power. So as a result, there's more price making power. There is, as the question says, persistent economies of scale. So we have to accept that as a given. And as a result, so it's persistent economies of scale, increasing ability to influence prices, and most importantly, supernormal profit. Those are the main features of a monopoly, that monopolies usually make supernormal profit. And now that we have a mental note of what the key features of a monopoly or a large firm are, let's see which of these choices fit that description. So choice A, ability to set its own prices will increase. Sure, that certainly satisfies our condition for large firms. But before we can say that it's A, let's just put a dot next and say, okay, A is under consideration, but let's just see what B, C, and D have to offer. So B, long run average cost curve will be U-shaped. Okay, so what U-shaped implies is that it goes down and then it goes up. So in other words, you initially experience economies of scale, but as you get larger and larger as a firm, you might experience diseconomies of scale. Now, while that's not wrong, like technically the average cost curve in most settings is U-shaped, remember what the question has told you, persistent economies of scale. Persistent economies of scale implies that the average cost curve is constantly declining. And as a result, we don't have a U-shaped cost curve, and therefore B is out. C, increasing profitability will attract many new entrants. Okay, it's understandable why candidates would want to say, would think that it's C, because yes, we will probably have higher profitability, because if you think back to your theory of the monopoly, monopolies tend to have supernormal profit. They tend to achieve supernormal profit. And what supernormal profits do is it sends a signal for new firms to enter that market. But remember, in our theory of, let's say, contestability, that if the market is not contestable, meaning that it has significant barriers to entry, whether that's the government erecting artificial barriers to entry, or whether that's natural barriers to entry, such as very high fixed costs, you can't assume that increasing profitability will attract many new entrants, because even if I want to enter this highly profitable industry, I may not be able to. And as a result, B and C is out as well. Let's look at D. Total cost of production will decrease. This is not the case, for the simple reason that persistent economies of scale refers to average cost of production will decrease, not total cost. The total cost will continuously increase as you produce more output. And the reason is because if you want to produce more output as a firm, so let's imagine I'm a car company. If I want to produce more cars, I have to buy more steel, I have to pay for more workers, I have to buy more component parts in general. And that costs money. Steel costs money, workers have to be paid. So as a result, there's no reason why my total cost would decrease. And as a result, the only viable option left is A, ability to set its own prices. Now, moving on to the last question that the examiner report had pointed out is question 30. About 29% of candidates got this correct, if I remember correctly. And this table shows the indices for real GDP and consumer prices over 6 quarters. Now, before you even look at the choices, and this is particularly true for questions in which you have data, I'd encourage you to just look at what is going on. So let's first start off with real GDP. So real GDP starts at 106, it falls in quarter 2, and it falls in quarter 3. So real GDP has fallen for for 2 quarters. Now remember what the definition of a recession is. A recession is when an economy experiences a decline in real GDP for at least 2 quarters. So that satisfies our condition. So we seem to have started off with a recession. But what's happened after? The good news is that things have seemed to bottom out at 104. And since that time, we continue to see increasing output, implying that the economy has experienced a recovery. So what we have is a recession followed by a recovery, and the recession happens first. Now, let's look at the index of consumer prices. In the entire 6 quarters, you don't see consumer prices falling at any point. So the consumer price index is continuously increasing, meaning we can rule out deflation. So let's look at what we have. In order to find out what inflation is, we'd have to find the change in the consumer price index, the percentage change in the consumer price index. And between quarter 1 and quarter 2, it's a 5% change. In quarter 3, if you were to do 111 minus 105 divided by 105 times by 100, you'd find that the inflation rate is about 5.4%. So, okay, we have rising inflation for the first 2 quarters. But then what do we have? 116 minus 111. Well, that is still an increase, but less than 5%. And as a result, it slowed down. Look again here. It's also been slowing down. And then by the time we get to quarter 6, the inflation rate has fallen to about 2.5%, down from about 5% in the second quarter. So what we can say is that the consumer price index has been increasing, although at a slower rate. And that slowdown in the consumer price index has happened in the later quarters during the recovery. So here's what we can say. We can say that we've had a recession, and during that recession, we had, well, pretty wild inflation, 5%. That's significantly higher than the central bank's target of 2%. And then what we had was a recovery. And during that recovery, we still had inflation, but at a slower rate. Now, inflation at a slower rate is otherwise known as disinflation. So we have a recession followed by recovery and disinflation. So which of these choices satisfies what we have seen from the data. So start off with choice A, deflation and a recession. No, because there was no deflation, so we can rule that out. B, disinflation when in recession. So what that means is during quarters 2 and 3, when we had a recession, did we have disinflation? And the answer is no. What we found was that, in fact, inflation had risen. It was 5% in quarter 2 and about 5.5% in quarter 3. So we can rule out A and B as a result. Let's look at C, disinflation when recovering from recession. Yes, that's what we found based on the data. So C seems like the most likely choice, but just to be safe, let's have a look at choice D. Rising inflation when recovering from a recession. No, it's understandable why candidates would think that, because when you're recovering from a recession, it implies that we have more aggregate demand and therefore more inflation. But this is not the case, so more demand pull inflation. But that's not what the data has suggested to us. So as a result, the only viable option is C. So I hope this video is useful to you in terms of understanding how to approach a multiple choice section. The main thing that I would say is, before you even look at the choices, especially if you have data or if you have diagrams like in question 5 for that subsidy, just think about what do you see? So where is the equilibrium point if it's a diagram? Why has the supply curve shifted to the right? And that was because of the subsidy. And in the case of the numerical questions, just describe what you see with the data. What is the trend? Is the GDP going up? Is it going down? What is happening to inflation, and or whatever else has been given to you? And then once you have created a mental picture of what is going on with the data, then you can see your choices and then engage in the process of elimination and say, okay, which of these choices satisfies what I saw? Which one satisfies it best? And that's how I think you should approach your multiple choice. And the multiple choice section is quite important in the sense that it is highly accessible, that you can access good marks. And if you can get, high 20s out of 30, then that really does set you up in case either your essay is not as good as you hoped or another part of the paper was not as good as you hoped. So thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.